The bag ruptured on Elm Street at 1:58 in the afternoon, right outside Cutler and Sons Hardware, on a Friday in February, when the wind off the river was the kind that gets under everything and has opinions about it. I heard the seam give before I felt the weight leave my hands. A soft, domestic pop. The sound of plastic stretched past its intention. And then the contents of Dennis's Ashland file became airborne. Manila folders, crisp envelopes, a thick rubber-banded packet I'd been so careful with all morning, tucking it against my side in the car, setting it on the passenger seat rather than the floor. All of it lifted on the river wind and scattered across the wet sidewalk and into the gutter and against the hardware store window like a hand of cards thrown in disgust. I made a sound I had never heard come out of my own body before, something between a sob and a word I would not normally use on a public street. I was on my knees on the pavement in my good camel coat before I'd even decided to move, gathering pages with both hands, sliding on the wet stone, watching a white envelope skate toward the storm drain and thinking, "No, no, please, no," when I became aware of someone beside me. He came from the direction of a parked car, a Cadillac the approximate color of old copper pipe, and he moved with the particular deliberate care of someone who has made peace with gravity and found the arrangement mutually agreeable. He bent, slowly, with some effort, a hand briefly on his knee, and retrieved a single document from the edge of the gutter near the drainage grate. He straightened. He looked at it. He read it. Something changed in his face that I cannot quite describe, except to say that it was not alarm. It was something quieter than alarm. The specific stillness of a man who has recognized something he was not expecting to find. He looked at me. Quietly, controlled, urgent. Who prepared this document? Breathless, hands full of wet paper. What? A lawyer. It's my husband's estate file. Can you please just help me? Not loud, steady as a hand on a shoulder. Listen carefully. Who is your husband? The question was strange enough that I actually stopped reaching for the last envelope. Confused, looking up at him. Dennis Croft, why does that? Watching me with those very clear gray eyes. This is a general power of attorney, not limited to estate administration. This authorizes Dennis Croft to sell, transfer, or encumber any real property registered under your name. The street sounds seemed to pull back. The hardware store window with its display of snow shovels and de-icing salt. A bicycle locked to the rack outside the cafe 2 doors down. The drainage grate where one more page was sitting and getting wet. I registered all of these things with a peculiar, dissociated clarity, as if someone had turned down the volume on everything except the old man's voice. Slowly, trying to locate the logic. I signed that for estate administration after my grandmother died. It was supposed to be limited, interrupting gently but without equivocation. Look at this one. He held out a second document he'd retrieved from the gutter. It was a purchase and sale agreement. The property address listed was Calder Road, Hartwell, Connecticut. The seller line bore my name. The buyer line read Marcus Slade, Slade & Associates, LLC. The purchase price was $85,000. I knew, in the general way that people know things they haven't investigated, that my grandmother's land was worth more than $85,000. I didn't know by how much. I was about to learn. He held out a third document, a government survey report dated January 14th of this year, bearing the letterhead of the Hartwell Regional Planning Commission. It was a preliminary acquisition assessment for the Hartwell Regional Transit Corridor Phase 2. The assessed value for parcel 14-887-C Calder Road. My grandmother's 2.3 acres, her tomato garden, the farmhouse where I'd learned to sew, the porch roof where Gerald held court, was $342,000. The wind moved. Someone walked past on the sidewalk, stepping around us without comment. February in Hartwell produces a certain studied indifference to other people's difficulties. My hands went very still, not shaking, still in the way they go when I'm about to cut a difficult piece and I need everything to be absolutely precise. The closing is today. He was already standing. Get everything. My car is there, the Cadillac. We go now. I gathered the remaining papers with hands that were not yet shaking, but were thinking seriously about it. I looked at the man who had appeared from a copper-colored car and read my ruined life out of a puddle on Elm Street. Still on my knees, last page in hand. Who are you? He was already moving. Theodore Ashworth. I was your father's attorney about 20 years ago. I retired 8 years ago, but I still read documents. Get in the car. I got up. I got in the car. We had 47 minutes. Every story that ends at a notary's office has to start somewhere quieter. This one started in a bakery on Millbrook Avenue, 11 years before any of this, when I was 23 and picking up a birthday cake for my father, and a man I'd never seen before reached past me for the last chocolate croissant. He had the grace to look immediately mortified. He offered it to me. I said no. He broke it in half with his hands right there at the counter, and we stood eating pastry and talking for 45 minutes, and by the time I left, I knew his name was Dennis Croft, and he sold commercial real estate, and he had gone to UConn on a partial scholarship, and he had a laugh that started slow and built like something genuinely surprised to find itself funny. He had a way of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. I was 23, and I had never particularly felt like the most interesting person in any room before. It worked. My name is Lydia Wren. I was born Lydia Wren, and I stayed Lydia Wren until I became Lydia Croft at 24, and stayed that way for the next 11 years, during which I slowly forgot, in the incremental way that marriages accomplish this, that the girl who'd spent summers at her grandmother's kitchen table learning to read fabric and set seams had always had her own name and her own particular way of seeing the world. The forgetting is gradual. It doesn't announce itself. One morning you realize the financial spreadsheets have only one person's handwriting in them, and that person is not you. And you've been telling yourself for years that this is a reasonable division of labor. I worked at Premier Designs on Hartwell's commercial strip, a bridal and formal alterations boutique that occupied a former pharmacy and smelled faintly on humid days of the old building's medicinal past. I had been senior seamstress there for 8 years. I could look at a garment and understand within 30 seconds exactly where it was failing, which seam was pulling incorrectly, what adjustment would make the whole thing hang right, where the original cutter had made an assumption that the fabric was quietly disagreeing with. My boss, Helen Myers, called me indispensable on a regular basis and paid me approximately 15% below what indispensable usually commands. I accepted this because I was good at accommodating the gap between what things were worth and what I was being offered. I understand now that I had been practicing this skill in more than one area of my life. Dennis was in commercial real estate in the way that people inhabit fields they have been almost succeeding in for a decade. Handshakes and dinners and optimistic spreadsheets. He was genuinely good at the beginning of things, the pitch, the relationship, the vision of what a deal could be. He was less reliable at the part where you followed through on what you'd promised, where the patient, unglamorous work of closing actually happened. We'd had 3 years of deals that were just about to close on something big before I stopped tracking the individual promises and simply understood that our financial situation would be variable. We managed. We covered the mortgage on the Maple Heights house. We had a retirement account that we were both contributing to, though I did not know at the time that the contributions had become somewhat irregular on his side. He handled the finances. He said he was better with numbers. I believed him. He preferred it. My grandmother Irene died on a Tuesday in February at 81 in the bed where she'd slept for 60 years in the farmhouse on Calder Road. She died on a Tuesday because that was the kind of woman she was, orderly, unpretentious, with a preference for the middle of the week. I had been with her the Friday before, sitting in her kitchen with tea, and she'd been telling me about a pattern she was adapting for a neighbor's granddaughter, adjusting it for narrow shoulders and a longer waist, explaining her reasoning as she went, in the precise, attentive way she always shared knowledge, not showing off, not instructing, just thinking out loud and letting you follow along if you were paying attention. She taught me to sew the same way. I would sit at her kitchen table with the pinning scissors and the box of mismatched buttons she collected from every garment that was too far gone to save, and she would talk me through whatever she was working on, and I would watch her hands, and gradually my hands learned to do what hers did. She never once made me feel that I was learning. She made me feel that I was already a part of the process and simply discovering that I'd been at it all along. She left me everything: the farmhouse, the 2.3 acres, the tomato garden, the sewing table in the upstairs room where the light was best, and Gerald. Gerald T. Wren was a bronze turkey, 16 pounds of absolute conviction, and he had been registered as Irene's emotional support animal since 2019 under the provisions of the Fair Housing Act and associated Connecticut statutes governing ESA designations. This was not informal or approximate. Gerald had a laminated card bearing his photograph. He'd sat for it with the particular cooperative patience of someone who finds bureaucratic processes beneath them, but understands their necessity. And his ESA registration number was 4471-CONN. Irene had kept the card in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus, between the Thai Places card and the pizza coupons that had expired in 2021, as though it were a perfectly normal document to have in a kitchen drawer, which in her kitchen it was. Gerald had been a rescue. She'd found him as a very young poult on the side of Route 44, apparently having made an involuntary departure from a transport vehicle, and she'd brought him home in a laundry basket and fed him by hand for the first 3 weeks and registered him formally on the grounds that a turkey living in a residential structure required proper documentation, which she obtained with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. In the years since, Gerald had developed a firm territorial relationship with the farmhouse property, a measured but not hostile policy toward approved humans, and what I can only describe as a professional demeanor. He took his responsibilities seriously, he kept regular hours, and he was absolutely clear about which decisions were his to make. I was one of the humans he had approved of. The approval process had been gradual and apparently involved criteria I was never fully briefed on. But by the time I was 28 and visiting Irene on weekends, Gerald would follow me around the property at an invariable distance of approximately 4 feet, close enough to be in my peripheral vision, far enough to maintain professional independence. And this I understood as acceptance. Dennis was not an approved human. Gerald had formed this opinion within their first encounter and had not revised it in 3 years. The week after the funeral, Dennis sat across from me at our kitchen table in Maple Heights with his reading glasses on and his patient voice engaged, and explained, very carefully, that the Calder Road property was going to present significant ongoing financial obligations. Lida, sweetheart, I've been looking at the numbers. Property taxes on a parcel that size are going to run us $11,000–12,000 a year at minimum. The farmhouse needs a new roof. I had someone do a quick drive-by and the east slope is already showing damage. The well pump is original equipment. There's a septic system that hasn't been inspected in who knows how long. Every weekend you'd want to go out there is money and time and— He paused, reorganized whatever he'd been about to say next. She's gone, babe. I know how much that place meant to you. But keeping a property you can't realistically maintain isn't honoring her memory. It's just carrying a weight. And the market's good right now. We could use the liquidity. We could pay down the mortgage, invest the difference, actually build something. I sat with my hands around my coffee mug, still in the gray sweater I'd worn to the funeral, and looked at the window above the sink and thought about the farmhouse kitchen and the smell of tomato plants on a warm afternoon, and the way Gerald would appear on the porch roof at around 4 o'clock, surveying the property with the alert gravity of a supervisor conducting an unannounced inspection. I'm not ready to sell. Of course not. I'm just saying, let's keep our options open. I said, okay. I didn't rule it out. I also continued driving out to Calder Road twice a week, carrying feed in the back of my car, and spending an hour or two in the house and the yard, checking the gutters and the foundation and the furnace pilot light, maintaining things in the incremental way that things are maintained when you love them. Gerald supervised these visits from his positions of choice: the porch roof, the fence post at the far end of the south field, occasionally the top of the chicken coop where the previous chickens had lived before they predated out years ago, which Gerald had annexed as additional territory. I went to see the estate attorney a week and a half after the funeral. His name was Daniel Hess, and he had an office on Commerce Street that smelled of old coffee and legal copy paper, and the particular interior climate of a space where difficult conversations happen every day, and the furniture has absorbed all of them. He was 60-something, pleasant, with reading glasses perpetually halfway down his nose, and a bookshelf that had 3 copies of the Connecticut Probate Code and a framed law school diploma from 1987. He shook my hand and said Irene was a remarkable woman, and he was sorry for my loss. And I thanked him, and we went through the estate documents, and I signed several things, including a general power of attorney that Dennis had suggested would make the estate administration process more efficient. It just means I can interface with Hess directly on the administrative side, Dennis had said at home the evening before, when we'd gone through what I'd need to bring. You don't have to drive downtown every time something needs a signature. Let me handle the routine stuff, so you don't have to think about it when you're already dealing with so much. The document Hess placed in front of me was several pages. I read the cover page, which described it as a power of attorney granted by Lydia Ann Croft to Dennis Robert Croft for purposes relating to estate administration. I did not read the subsequent pages carefully. I was 48 hours past the funeral, and I trusted my husband, and I thought, this is what marriages are. You trust. You let the person who handles the numbers handle the numbers. You sign. Hess watched me sign with the expression of a man who has witnessed this particular moment in various forms more times than he can count. I understand now what he was watching. I did not understand it then. That was the document Theodore Ashworth read on Elm Street 6 months later with a stillness in his jaw that I would not recognize as alarm until I was already in his car. By November, I had been going to Stitch and Switch for almost 4 years, and it was the most consistently honest environment in my life, which was not something I had consciously understood until I tried to describe it to someone outside the group and couldn't. Rita Flood had started it. Rita lived directly across the street from us in a vintage Craftsman she maintained with the systematic competence of a person who has discovered that contractors are both expensive and frequently wrong, and has drawn the obvious conclusion. She was 38, divorced for 6 years from a man she referred to exclusively as the human-shaped disappointment, and she worked in insurance claims with the moral clarity of someone who has spent a decade watching people construct elaborate fictions about fender benders and has simply run out of patience for dishonesty in any register. She was my closest friend. She had an instinct for human bullshit that I should have borrowed more aggressively. She had read an article about textile waste and within 24 hours had texted the group chat. Okay, new thing. Second Tuesday of every month. Bring broken, unwanted, or hideous clothes. We fix, swap, or destroy responsibly. Wine provided. It's either this or I start a podcast and you'll like this better. The group had been 4: Rita, Margot Hale, Connie Sparks, and me. We'd been meeting ever since, rotating the host duty, drinking wine, working on fabric, and talking. Loudly, honestly, occasionally with language that would have alarmed the neighbors if the neighbors had been paying attention, which in Maple Heights they generally were not. Margot Hale was a librarian at the Hartwell Public Library, quiet in the specific way of someone who has access to an enormous amount of information and has learned through long experience that most of it is more powerful when deployed selectively. She was 36, precise, with the ability to Google anything in under 10 seconds and the wisdom to do it silently first. Connie Sparks was a real estate agent with 3 children, a husband who cooked beautifully and was intimidated by almost nothing, and a cellular connection that never dropped below 4 bars. She was capable of simultaneously drinking Malbec, listening to an upsetting story, and cross-referencing public property records. And she did all 3 without appearing to divide her attention. The November meeting was at Margot's apartment. Clean, organized, warm, with a bookshelf that took up an entire wall and a sewing basket as well organized as a reference collection. I hadn't told any of them yet that something about Dennis's behavior in the weeks since the funeral had started to feel like a radio signal, slightly off frequency. Technically functional, but producing a persistent low-grade interference that I couldn't quite identify. I mentioned it obliquely, working on a hem, not quite complaining, just noting. He's been a lot since the estate, about the property, about selling. Rita didn't look up from the jacket she was relining. What a surprise. The man who has never successfully maintained a houseplant has opinions about what to do with 2.3 acres of your inheritance? The answer I'd given people for years. He's practical. Not arguing, just documenting. Sure. Margot looked up briefly from a skirt she was taking in. Carefully, a librarian noting a research possibility. Have you looked at the Regional Planning Commission filings for that corridor? Calder Road came up in the meeting minutes I processed for the archive last month. Why would it come up? There's a transit expansion proposal under review. Infrastructure acquisition. The commission's been mapping potential parcels along that stretch for about a year. I filed this away. I did not do anything with it. I was still in the mode of trusting that the relevant people in my life would alert me to relevant information, because that was what relevant people did. That was, in retrospect, the second piece of the mosaic. I left it on Margot's coffee table next to a pincushion and a glass of Malbec, and didn't think about it again for 3 months. December brought what I think of now as the garage calls. I noticed Dennis on his phone in the garage in the evenings, which was not unprecedented. He sometimes paced when he was working through a deal, but the frequency was new, and the duration, and the specific way he'd come back inside, straight to his laptop rather than to the kitchen to debrief me in the casual, sharing his day manner he usually had. The garage visits went from occasional to regular somewhere around the second week of December, and they lasted between 15 minutes and half an hour, and they happened after 9 p.m. when the neighborhood was quiet. I noticed, and I told myself I was constructing something from nothing, which is a thing I had gotten very good at doing. There was a name, Marcus. I saw it once, a text notification on Dennis's phone face up on the kitchen counter, visible for maybe 2 seconds before he picked the phone up with a casualness that had been fractionally too practiced. Marcus says the survey timeline is, and then the screen was face down and Dennis was asking if I wanted anything from the fridge, his voice entirely normal. I didn't ask about Marcus. Dennis had dozens of business contacts I didn't track. That was the arrangement. Piece 3. In January, I found an envelope in the inner pocket of his sport coat when I was taking it to be dry cleaned. I always check pockets. You find remarkable things in garment pockets if you do this consistently, and I'd found grocery receipts and parking stubs, and once a gift card with $40 still on it. And my fingers closed around a thick envelope with a return address embossed in the upper left corner. Slade and Associates, Commercial Real Estate, LLC. I stood in the kitchen with the envelope in my hand for a moment. I put it back. I thought, he's working on a deal with someone named Slade. That's normal. That's what commercial real estate looks like. I dropped the coat at Hanson's Cleaners on River Street and thought about the envelope for most of the drive home, and then parked it in the back of my mind next to the garage calls and the name Marcus and Margot's comment about the Planning Commission, and let the whole collection sit there, unconnected. Piece 4. And then it was February 3rd, the anniversary of Irene's death, and Dennis brought me white tulips, which she had loved, and sat beside me on the couch and held my hand and told me he knew this year had been hard and that he was working on something. He couldn't say too much yet, but he thought it was going to feel like a relief. He thought it was going to be good for both of them. Just trust me, a little longer. I looked at the tulips and thought about Irene's garden and said, okay. He had filed the purchase and sale agreement with Marcus Slade 5 days earlier. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday. I did not know any of this on February 3rd, but I know it now, and every time I think about those tulips, the care with which he chose them, the fact that he knew they were her flowers, I feel something I don't have a clean word for. Not just betrayal, something more precise, the sense of having been studied. The morning the bag tore was a Friday. I had the morning off. Helen was at a supplier meeting and didn't need me until 2. And I'd driven out to Calder Road before breakfast to check on the gutters on the north side, which I'd noted on my last visit were starting to show leaves despite my having cleaned them in October. I went out 3 or 4 times a month, usually with coffee in my thermos and an hour or 2 to spend checking on things. Gerald was on the porch roof when I arrived, in his early morning supervisory position, watching the driveway with the composed authority of a security professional who has seen everything and found nothing yet that required escalation. He watched me get out of the car. He watched me unload the feed bag from the trunk. He watched me fill his feeders without moving from the roof, because the filling of feeders was my job, and he had his. I checked the gutters. The north side needed clearing. I made a note to do it next visit or get someone out. Walked through the farmhouse rooms, ran the taps to keep the pipes from sitting, checked the furnace. The house smelled of old wood and the specific dry warmth of a heated space that no one is actively living in. It smelled like something waiting. I stood in the upstairs sewing room for a few minutes, where Irene's dress form still stood in the corner in a half-buttoned blouse she'd never finished altering. And I thought, in the spring, I am going to start actually using this room. I'm going to bring my machines out here. I'm going to plant her tomatoes again. I'm going to make this work. Gerald had descended from the porch roof by the time I came back downstairs and was stationed on the porch itself, approximately 4 feet to the left of the door, conducting a general survey of the south field. We sat together, him standing, me on the porch steps with my thermos, in the February quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has texture. You could hear the distant road, a bird somewhere in the tree line, the particular stillness of cold air not moving. My phone buzzed at 12:43. Dennis. "Babe, forgot the Ashland file. Can't do anything without it. Please." And then, 30 seconds later, "At Dunmore and Webb Notary on Millbrook. Should be done by 3. Appointment is 2:45. I looked at the message. The Ashland file had been sitting on his desk for days. I'd seen it, a substantial rubber-banded packet with Ashland written across the front in his handwriting. I'd assumed it was one of his commercial deals. I thought about the drive, 12 miles to Hartwell to pick it up, then 8 more to Millbrook. I thought about the fact that his appointment couldn't proceed without what was in that packet. Gerald was watching me read my phone, or possibly watching a point past my phone. With Gerald, it was sometimes difficult to determine the precise object of his attention. Out loud, to Gerald, to nobody. He needs his file. Gerald blinked once, slowly. The particular blink that meant, I have processed this information and am withholding my assessment. I drove back to Hartwell. I found the packet on Dennis's desk and put it in a plastic grocery bag because that was what was at hand and I was in a hurry. I should have found the canvas tote. I know that now. If I had used the canvas tote, I would have arrived at Dunmore and Webb on Millbrook at 2:20-something and handed my husband a packet of documents and waited while he concluded a transaction and then driven home, and sometime later, a week, 2 weeks, when things settled, when the right moment came, Dennis would have told me that the farmhouse had been sold, and he would have had a story ready, and I would have believed it, because that was what I did. But I used the plastic bag, and I took the Elm Street route to Millbrook, which was 3 minutes shorter than River Street, and the handle seam gave out in front of Cutler & Sons Hardware at 1:58 on a Friday afternoon. And Theodore Ashworth was parked there because he'd just dropped off a lamp for repair and was returning to his car. The Cadillac was a 1974 DeVille, the color of old copper, and it moved through Hartwell traffic at a measured 26 miles per hour that Theo appeared to consider both appropriate and non-negotiable. His hands were at 10 and 2. He did not appear to own a GPS or to require one. There was a Christmas tree air freshener on the rearview mirror that had been there long enough to have achieved a kind of vintage status, and a road atlas in the door pocket that looked like it had been consulted recently. And the car smelled of old leather and something faintly piney, and the particular settled quality of a space that belongs entirely and unapologetically to one person. I sat in the passenger seat with the documents on my lap and tried to read everything at once while simultaneously understanding what I was reading. The general power of attorney was prepared by Hess in March. Your grandmother died in February. The document was filed with the registry approximately 3 weeks after probate opened. He said it was standard for estate administration. A limited power of attorney for estate administration is standard. This is not limited. This grants your husband authority over any and all real property in your name indefinitely, without requiring your presence or approval. I turned to the third document, the government survey, and read the assessed value again. $342,000. I turned to the purchase and sale agreement. $85,000. He was going to sell it for $85,000. The difference, if the government acquisition proceeds at the assessed value, is $257,000. $257,000. I had a number for what my grandmother's land was worth to the man I'd been married to for 11 years. Maybe he didn't know about the government survey. Maybe he thought 85 was fair. The survey was dated January 14th. The purchase agreement was executed on January 21st. 1 week. He had known the government assessment for 1 week before he finalized the sale price with Marcus Slade. He had known exactly what the land was worth, and he had arranged to sell it for a quarter of that to a buyer who was, in all probability, planning to turn around and sell it to the government at the assessed price. I thought, this is what he was doing in the garage. Every call, every evening, in December and January and February, this was the thing he was building in the dark. Very controlled, working to stay that way. How did he know about the transit corridor, the survey? Thoughtful, turning the question over. Planning Commission filings are public record. Anyone with a subscription to the Commission's notification service would receive routing proposals when they're filed. I would imagine someone in commercial real estate maintains such subscriptions routinely. Margot's voice from November. Calder Road came up in the meeting minutes I processed for the archive last month. She'd said it casually, noting a research possibility. I hadn't followed the thread. Measuring this out carefully. He told me in October that the property was a liability, that the taxes and maintenance were too much. He said we should sell. Theo glanced at me, just briefly, the way he did, just enough to confirm he'd heard. Precisely, which would have been approximately 1 month after the corridor routing was announced in the Planning Commission minutes. The timing assembled itself in front of me like a pattern pinned to a board. September, routing announced. October, Dennis begins managing my perceptions about the property. November, he calls Hess to discuss the acquisition timeline and, presumably, the scope of the power of attorney I'd signed in March. December, the garage calls, finalizing the arrangement with Slade. January, survey completed, sale price set, agreement executed. February 3rd, tulips, white, because he knew she loved them and because the closing was 5 days away and he needed me to feel, on that specific day, that I could trust him. I closed my eyes for a moment. The Cadillac moved through Hartwell at 26 miles per hour, entirely unhurried, as if it had made a private agreement with time. Without drama, not looking at me. There's something else. He reached into his breast pocket, the overcoat, the iron-colored wool, and produced a folded piece of paper I hadn't seen him pick up from Elm Street. He handed it to me without looking away from the road. It was a printout of a text message thread. The names at the top were Dennis and Brooke. I recognized the format. Someone had screenshotted a phone conversation and printed it. The paper had gotten wet at one corner, and the ink had bled slightly. The messages were dated from October through early February. I read them. Not all of them. There were several pages, and some of them I read, and some of them I moved past quickly, because some things you can only take in small quantities when you're sitting in a Cadillac on your way to stop your husband from selling your grandmother's land, and you need your hands to stay steady. The one I kept returning to was from October 17th. Brooke, Once the property transfers, you'll have the capital to buy into the River Street Partnership. My uncle confirmed he can hold your spot for 60 days. Dennis. What's Hess's timeline for the filing? Brooke. He's not asking questions. Stay patient with her. Don't rush it or she'll notice. I read that one 3 times, the last sentence specifically. Don't rush it or she'll notice. 8 months. They had been managing the pace of this for 8 months. Not so fast she notices. Very flat from somewhere remote. Who is Brooke? Brooke Finch. She's an associate at Slade's office. Your husband met her at an industry event in September. I had been at that event. I remembered it dimly. One of the professional cocktail parties Dennis occasionally brought me to, where I stood at his elbow and met 30 people whose names I didn't retain because I wasn't in the industry, and there was no reason to retain them. A woman with copper-colored hair and a cream blazer who'd shaken both our hands. I'd smiled and moved on. She had been managing the timeline of my husband's scheme since September. She had been in communication with the estate attorney. She had been telling Dennis how fast to move, how to keep me from noticing, how to maintain the temperature of the deception at exactly the right level. And I had shaken her hand and not remembered her name. How long have you been carrying that paper? I picked it up off the street. It was near the hardware store window. I wasn't sure what it was until I'd read it. And you just decided to... I recognized the property address. I recognized the name Croft. I knew your father. I read the document. A pause. I am very sorry. Outside, Hartwell continued doing whatever Hartwell does at 2:20 on a Friday in February. The coffee shop on River Street with its hand-lettered specials board, the parking garage on Millbrook, the old bank building with the stone colonnade that everyone agreed was beautiful and no one could quite figure out how to use. It's 2:23. I know. Drive faster. I'll after that at a speed appropriate to road conditions. He did not accelerate. We arrived at Dunmore and Webb Notary at 2:39. We had 6 minutes. The waiting room at Dunmore and Webb was beige in the specific way of spaces designed to be neutral during difficult moments. Upholstered chairs and a fabric suggesting institutional calm. A table with 3 outdated magazines. A receptionist who had achieved the expression of someone who witnesses complex situations from a safe professional distance and has learned not to have opinions about them. Through the glass partition, I could see the interior conference room. Dennis was at a table with a man I'd never met. 50s, expensive suit, the particular groomed confidence of someone who has closed many deals and considers paperwork a formality. And across from them, a notary. Dennis had his phone out. He was typing something. He had not yet looked up. The receptionist looked at me. "Can I help you?" "Very Lydia Croft. I need to speak with the notary." That was when Dennis looked up. I have replayed this moment many times. The glass was between us, and it created a kind of remove, like watching a scene from outside a stage. And what I saw in his face in the half second before the professional recovery was not guilt exactly. It was the specific alarm of someone who has a plan and has just watched a critical component become uncooperative. His face did something complicated and fast, and then it smoothed over, and he stood and came out of the conference room with his hands open and his voice already calibrated to warmth. "Lita, hey, what are you doing here? You didn't have to. You forgot the Ashland file." He looked at the documents in my hands. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. I watched it happen, the assessment of what I might have read and what I might know. "Right, yes, but look, you didn't need to come all this way. I'm almost done in here. I can handle this without the... I'd like to speak with the notary." warmth stiffening just slightly. Babe, it's complicated. There's a lot of context you'd be missing. Why don't you head home and I'll be there by 4 and we can talk. Theo stepped forward from behind me. He did not move dramatically. He did not raise his voice or make any particular gesture. He simply occupied more of the room than such a quiet man should have been able to, and Dennis stopped. Harold Dunning? He addressed the notary, who had appeared at the conference room doorway with the expression of a man who had not anticipated his Friday containing narrative. Theodore Ashworth, Connecticut Bar, retired. I'm with Mrs. Croft, who would like to invoke her right to revoke the general power of attorney filed in her name in March of this year. Revocation is the principal's right, exercisable in person, without cause, at any time prior to the execution of any instrument under that authority. Dennis's face went somewhere I hadn't seen it go before. Harold Dunning looked between the three of us, then at the conference table, then at the man in the expensive suit, Marcus Slade, who had not moved from his chair and whose face had become a careful blank, with the expression of a person who is performing a rapid assessment of liability. He cleared his throat. Mr. Ashworth, I'll need to see some identification. Theo produced his wallet, his retired bar card, his driver's license, and, from the breast pocket of the wool overcoat, because of course it was there, a notarized professional reference document of some kind that I had not known he carried and which Harold Dunning examined for a solid 30 seconds before nodding. Dunning looked at me. Careful a note of genuine kindness underneath. Mrs. Croft, are you here of your own free will to revoke the general power of attorney granted in your name in March? Absolutely clear. Yes. You understand that revoking this power of attorney will halt any pending transactions executed under its authority? Without hesitation. Yes, that's why I'm here. Dennis put a hand on my arm. Lyda, stop. Just stop and think. You don't understand what you're doing here. I looked at his hand on my arm. I looked at him. I understand exactly what I'm doing. He let go. Dunning returned to the conference table. The sounds of him pulling documents, a desk drawer opening, papers. Dennis moved to stand between me and the conference room door. He glanced at the receptionist, at Theo, at Marcus Slade visible through the glass, and then his voice dropped and the warmth went out of it entirely. How did you find out? Someone talked to you. Who talked to you? Your bag broke. He processed that. Last attempt at reason. This is a completely legal transaction. I have the authority. The paperwork is signed in March under a representation that it was for estate administration. I held up the purchase agreement. I held up the survey. 85,000, Dennis, against 342. He looked at the survey document. I watched him read the number. I watched him do the math on what I now knew, and what I had documented, and what was happening in real time behind him. The silence that followed had architecture. You could feel its load-bearing walls. Marcus Slade had stood and was putting on his coat with the smooth efficiency of a man who has been in collapsing negotiations before and knows the moment to extract himself from the rubble. He picked up his briefcase. He did not look at me. He exchanged one brief, opaque look with Dennis, not apologetic, not accusatory, simply the look of two people acknowledging that a situation has changed and will be handled separately, and walked to the receptionist to make whatever arrangements he needed to make about his afternoon. Theo stood against the wall near the entrance, hands clasped in front of him, watching the room with the clear gray eyes of a man who is keeping track of everything and has decided that the next necessary action is mine. Harold Dunning came back out of the conference room with a form, formally to me. I'll need your signature here and here, acknowledging the revocation with today's date. I signed. I dated it. My handwriting was steady. Dennis waited until Dunning was back inside and then, very low, stripped down to something I hadn't seen before. Not the smooth operator, not the patient husband, just a man who is angry about something not going the way he planned. You have no idea what you've just walked away from. That deal was going to set us up. You think this job at Premier, your little sewing, you think that's going to be enough? I was building something. Still, clear. For who? He stopped. Same voice, same level. Who were you building it for, Dennis? He had no answer. Or he had one, and it wasn't something he was going to say in a notary's waiting room. Very final. I want you out of the house by the time I get home. Leave the keys on the counter. I picked up the documents. I walked to the door. Theo held it open. Outside, Millbrook Avenue was doing the unremarkable things that streets do on winter afternoons. A delivery truck double parked, a woman pushing a stroller, bare trees and gray sky, and the specific quality of winter light that makes everything look like it's waiting for something to happen. The something had just happened. I hadn't processed it yet. I wouldn't for a while. Theo walked beside me to the Cadillac. He unlocked the passenger door for me before going around to his side. He didn't say anything. Sometimes the most competent thing a person can do is be present and quiet while someone else absorbs an earthquake. We drove back toward Maple Heights at 26 miles per hour. Rita Flood was at my kitchen table by 4:15. She had come across the street when she saw my car in the driveway at an unusual hour, because that was the kind of attentiveness Rita practiced as a form of friendship. Not intrusive, not hovering, just aware. She knocked, I opened the door, and she looked at my face and walked in without asking. I gave her the short version while I made tea I wasn't going to drink. I told her about the bag, the documents, Theo, the drive, the notary. I told her about the purchase and sale agreement. I told her about the survey. I told her about Brooke Finch and 8 months of messages and the River Street development and the fact that Dennis had known about the government corridor in September and had spent the 5 months between September and February very carefully managing my opinions about my own property. Rita listened without interrupting, which was rare for her and indicated that she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she sat for a moment. Something between outrage and a kind of stunned respect at the audacity of it. He did all of this while bringing you tulips? On the anniversary of her death. With feeling extremely controlled. That absolute piece of shit. I poured water into the kettle. Dennis came downstairs with a bag at 5:15. He'd packed efficiently. A rolling carry-on and a duffel. The basics. Everything that was his and distinguishable as his. He had, as I said, always been good at the beginning of things and the end of things. The middle was where he lost the thread. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Rita was at the table with her arms crossed, and the expression she had in claims review when someone has submitted a repair estimate that's $700 over market rate and is trying to explain why. Dennis looked at her. He looked at me. He'd been working something up on the stairs. I could see the shape of it in his face, the composed, reasonable expression, the groundwork for an argument about how I'd misunderstood the situation, how this was about our financial future, how I owed him a conversation before making decisions. He saw Rita's face, and something in his calculation shifted. To me, quietly, one more attempt at the warmth. I'm going to stay at the Radisson. We should talk. When there's some distance. I was standing at the counter with my back to the kettle. I did not turn around. Leave the keys on the counter. A pause. The sound of keys on granite. The front door. The soft sound of the latch catching. Then, nothing. Just the kitchen and the kettle starting to heat and the February dark outside the window and Rita at the table, who sat very still for a moment and then said, quietly, without any edge in it, "God, Lita, I'm so sorry." I turned around and put my back against the counter and looked at the kitchen I'd chosen the appliances for and the calendar on the wall with the dentist appointment I'd made for Dennis in March, and the mail in the little wooden sorter by the window, and the coffee mug he'd used that morning still in the drying rack. I don't think I'm going to cry yet. That's fine. Can you call the girls? The Stitch and Switch emergency meeting convened at my kitchen table at 6:30 that evening. Margot arrived first with a casserole from her freezer. She maintained a small archive of ready meals for what she called circumstances, which in her experience meant other people's crises, because she managed her own too efficiently for casseroles to be necessary, and the contained, precise outrage of a librarian who has processed a very bad document and found it wanting. Connie arrived 12 minutes later, her youngest asleep in her SUV, her husband materializing to take over child duty while she walked in with a legal pad and a pen already clicking. Okay, so I know Marcus Slade by reputation. He's done several deals in the Calder Road corridor over the last 2 years. I always thought he was just bad at negotiation, consistently underpricing. But now I'm thinking he's specifically bad at negotiation with people who don't know the government acquisition timeline. She sat down. She looked at the documents I'd fanned across the table. Lida, he was going to flip it, wasn't he? Slade was going to buy it from Dennis, from you, at 85 and sell it to the transit authority at the assessed rate. I assume so. The regional transit expansion. The Phase 2 corridor routing was in the Planning Commission minutes in September. She turned the screen to show me. A public document, the kind of thing that appears in meeting archives and gets filed by librarians and retrieved by real estate professionals with subscriptions to notification services. When did Dennis start talking to you about selling? I thought about the kitchen table. October. The reasonable voice. The property is a liability, babe. October. Silence. 1 month after the routing was public. He knew. Already knowing, just needing to hear it said. He knew in September. He started managing me in October. He filed the POA extension, or whatever Hess did, in November or December. He got the survey in January. He set the price. He filed the agreement. He scheduled the closing for February. Rita, who has been quiet, finally. 5 fucking months. Connie, fast, connecting something. Wait, River Street. She was scrolling. She turned the phone around again. A listing. River Street mixed-use development. 1.2 million asking. Partnership interest available. Listed. Marcus Slade. Slade and Associates. In the associated disclosure, an interested partner noted Dennis R. Croft. This was listed in June. He's been trying to buy into this partnership for 8 months. The asking price for his stake is, she showed me, $300,000. The number sat on the table. The $85,000 from Slade, the $300,000 to Slade's partnership, the $257,000 gap between the sale price and the government assessment. The math of what my grandmother's land was worth to my husband versus what it was worth to the universe laid out in those 3 figures like a very simple equation. Margot had her phone out from the moment she'd arrived and had been quietly photographing everything: the purchase agreement, the survey, the text messages, Connie's screen, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understands that paper is evidence. Evidence is power, and power requires documentation. Looking up briefly, I'd also like to note that the power of attorney bears Hess's firm letterhead and his signature and his notarization. The attorney your grandmother's will designated to manage her estate prepared the instrument that enabled all of this, at Dennis's request, presumably with an understanding of what it would be used for, given that Dennis asked him within days of Irene's death about the government acquisition timeline. I had been holding that one. I'd been moving around it since the Cadillac, avoiding the direct look. Because Dennis's greed was, in its ugly way, comprehensible, Brooke Finch made a calculation, and I could see the shape of it even if I didn't respect it. Marcus Slade was a commercial operator doing what commercial operators do when they think nobody withstanding is paying attention. These were things I could file. But Hess, Daniel Hess, who had a framed diploma from 1987 and smelled of old coffee and had shaken my hand and said, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I'm sorry for your loss." Who had sat across from me 48 hours after the funeral and watched me sign a document without reading it and not said, "Mrs. Croft, this is broader than you may realize. You should read this carefully." Who had then, in the months that followed, taken Dennis's calls and discussed acquisition timelines and prepared the legal architecture of the plan, all without once calling me independently to say, "Your husband has some questions about the estate. I wanted to make sure you were aware." Very quiet to the table, to all of them. The person Irene trusted to protect what she'd built helped take it apart. Nobody said anything. Rita refilled her wine glass. Connie stopped clicking her pen. Margot set her phone down. That was the center of the mosaic. Not Dennis's scheme, not Brooke Finch's strategy, not Slade's acquisition plan. The center was Hess. The professional, the trusted institution, the man in the room with the knowledge and the obligation and the choice. And what he chose. I had trusted the system entirely. The husband, the attorney, the chain of people who were supposed to be on my side, because that was what husbands and attorneys were supposed to be. And every link in that chain had made a calculation about what I was worth versus what they stood to gain from my not knowing. After a long silence to the room, "What do I do now?" Rita, immediate, no hesitation. "You find yourself a lawyer who's afraid of absolutely nothing, and you take everything he has." Connie, already typing. "Patricia Crown. I'm texting you her number right now. She represented the Kellerman divorce last year. The husband was a developer. She made him cry. In public. Twice." Margot, quiet. "I'd also recommend calling the city planning office on Monday about the acquisition timeline and keeping every document in a single location tonight, ideally with backup copies." Rita, standing, matter of fact. "I'm sleeping on your couch." She said it like a logistical announcement, not a question, not a comfort offer, a statement of fact. "This is what happens now. I stay." Genuinely to her. "You don't have to." Absolutely not negotiating. "I know." She went to get a pillow from the closet. Margot made copies of everything on her phone. Connie did her real estate research until 11. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the mosaic of documents and thought about what to do next. I should tell you about the desk. Saturday morning, Margot came over at 9 and we went through Dennis's home office together. I want to be accurate about my state of mind during this. I was not upset in the way people often imagine someone is upset in these moments. I was very focused, specific. I kept thinking of it as a fitting, the way when you're doing a complex alteration, you move through the garment systematically, panel by panel, checking every seam, documenting every issue before you start any corrections. You don't skip ahead. You don't work from feeling. The desk was, as I said, a remarkable document of Dennis's inner life. The hotel receipt was first, the Radisson, our downtown Radisson, with its predictable business traveler amenities and its restaurant that did a reasonable weekday lunch. The bill was a single night per month, 8 months running, always the same Thursday, always the same room type. I noted this with the specific flatness that comes when a suspicion is confirmed, and the confirmation is exactly what you feared. There was the River Street offering memorandum, printed, annotated in Dennis's handwriting, with several highlighted passages about partnership structure and projected returns, and in the margin near the timeline section, a note in his hand that read, Slade confirms POA filed. Spring closing. Then we're clear for River Street. The word we're did a particular kind of damage. I set that page aside. There was a birthday card from Brooke Finch, which was in a pale blue envelope and which I opened and read once and then folded and placed in a separate pile because I was doing a fitting and not a catharsis, and I could have the catharsis later. There was a file folder labeled Calder Road, Acquisition Docs, which contained the preliminary survey from January 14th, a copy of the power of attorney I'd signed, several emails between Dennis and Hess's office about the scope of the POA document, and a note from Hess's assistant about the acquisition timeline that was dated November and referenced a conversation between Hess and Dennis on November 3rd, 8 days before Irene had been dead for a year. Margot photographed everything with the systematic calm of someone archiving a rare and damaged document. November 3rd. He called Hess in November to confirm the POA scope and the acquisition timeline. The same week you went out to the farmhouse for the holiday check. I had gone out to the farmhouse the week of Thanksgiving to check the pipes before the first hard freeze. I remembered Gerald on the porch roof in the November cold, looking at the driveway as I arrived. I remembered thinking, I should start the planning for what I want to do with this place in spring. Dennis had been calling Hess that same week to confirm the legal architecture for selling it without my knowledge. Nah, he was always very supportive about the farmhouse trips. He'd say, Go, take your time. I'll handle dinner. Very supportive. He needed you to keep going out there, to maintain the property until the closing. I hadn't thought of that. He'd needed the farmhouse maintained, the pipes not frozen, the gutters not backing up, the furnace running, because a neglected property would have complicated the sale. My twice-weekly caretaking visits had been, from his perspective, part of the operational plan. Something very cold and very precise moved through me. Can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think any of it was real? The marriage, I mean? Any of it? She set the phone down. She looked at me directly, which Margot did rarely, and therefore meant something when she did. I think some of it was real, and some of it was convenient, and I think he probably didn't fully distinguish between the two, which is, I think that might be worse, actually. Not that it helps. It didn't help, but it was accurate, which was the thing Margot always gave you instead of comfort. Accuracy. Sometimes that's the more useful gift. The recorded call happened the following Wednesday. Dennis had been at the Radisson. I confirmed this without any effort, since his credit card transactions were still visible on our shared account until I called the bank Monday morning, and the Radisson charge had appeared Saturday night along with a dinner charge at the hotel restaurant that included 2 glasses of a wine that cost $22 apiece. I noted this with the practiced detachment of someone who is now reading his financial behavior the way you read a garment, looking for where the structure reveals itself, where the spending habits tell you the actual story. He called me Tuesday evening. He wanted to talk. He said he felt terrible. He said there was context I didn't have, and he needed me to understand where he was coming from. He was in the warmth phase, the phase I'd lived inside for 11 years, the phase that had always worked, that had always made me recalibrate and soften and give the benefit of the doubt. I told him, before he said anything of substance, that I was recording the call, as was my right under Connecticut law. A pause. Okay, fine. I have nothing to hide. This was objectively an interesting position to take. He led with the strategy I'd predicted. This was a financial decision. He'd been trying to do what was best for both of them. The property was a genuine liability, and he'd found a solution. Yes, the communication could have been better. Yes, he should have involved her more directly, but the intent was sound. He loved her. He was trying to build something for their future. Which property specifically were you concerned about? The Calder Road farmhouse, your grandmother's land. And when did you become aware of the government acquisition assessment for that parcel? The survey the preliminary report was in the Ashland file. I'd seen it. When did you first learn about the transit corridor routing for that area? A pause. Longer. These regional infrastructure projects take a long time. The routing was speculative when... Dennis, when did you call Hess to ask about the acquisition timeline? A longer pause. I called Hess to discuss estate administration. That's what a husband does. What did you ask him specifically about the government survey schedule? I asked about the general timeline for any land use decisions that might affect the estate valuation. That's due diligence, Lyda. Any competent person handling an estate. You called him 3 days after Irene died, before we had even filed the estate. You called to ask about the government acquisition schedule. Silence. Dennis Gover was always going to be more valuable as a quick sale than sitting empty. If I hadn't moved on this, to you. A silence. What? It was more valuable as a quick sale to you, to fund a partnership investment with Slade for the River Street development that you've been trying to buy into for 8 months, while telling me the property was a liability. The silence that followed was very long. I could hear him breathing. How much do you actually know? I ended the call. I sat in the kitchen and played back the recording. When he said the survey showed and caught himself, that moment, 4 minutes and 32 seconds in, I played it twice. Patricia Crown would use that moment. That was where his careful construction had a seam that pulled. I sent a text to Theo at 11 that night. I have a recorded call. He admitted he knew the survey value before he filed the sale agreement. I'm meeting with an attorney tomorrow. He replied, "Good. Sleep first. I did not sleep first. I made a list on the back of an envelope and sat with Irene's pincushion on the kitchen table, the faded red velvet warm in my hands, and I thought about what I was going to do next. The night before I filed for divorce, I was in the kitchen at 2:15 in the morning. I had set out to sleep at 10:30 with the aggressive hopefulness of someone who knows they need to rest and is attempting to treat this as a solvable problem. By midnight, I had established that it was not, at least not yet, and had gotten up and come to the kitchen, which is where I do my actual thinking, the kind that doesn't involve planning or lists, but simply involves sitting with what's true and letting it settle. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The streetlight outside the window made a soft orange pool on the counter. My sewing kit was on the table. I'd been working on a commission piece earlier and hadn't put it away, and I pulled it toward me without thinking about it. And without thinking about it, I opened it and took out Irene's pincushion and held it. The velvet was worn soft on one side where her thumb had rested, and I put my thumb there too, the way I always had, and sat with it. I thought about the power of attorney I had signed without reading. I could not undo having signed it. I could not make myself younger or less trusting or make him less careful about the timing of when he'd asked. I had signed in good faith, and the good faith had been used against me, which was a form of damage I had to simply hold and not look away from. I thought about Hess, about the complaint I would be filing with the state bar as soon as Patricia Crown helped me understand what the grounds were and whether they would hold, about the specific quality of betrayal that came from an institution rather than a person, the feeling not of being stabbed, but of having the ground give out underfoot. I thought about Dennis, about the 11 years, about the morning he'd split the croissant in half, and I'd thought, this is a person who understands about sharing things, about how long that impression had served as the foundation of my understanding of who he was. I thought about what he'd said on the call, the way his voice had changed when he was no longer performing the warmth, when the calculation was visible underneath, the Planning Commission subscription, the text to Brooke Finch in October, the white tulips on the anniversary. He had studied me, carefully and well. He'd known I'd avoid anything that felt like conflict about the estate because I was grieving. He'd known I'd defer to his financial judgment because I always had. He'd known the tulips would work because he'd been paying attention to me for 11 years and had banked that information for exactly this kind of use. That was what marriages gave you, the capacity to be precisely, surgically betrayed by someone who knew exactly where you were soft. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, a car went past. The pincushion was warm in my hands. And then, at some point past 3, I thought, but he didn't know about Theo. He didn't know the bag was going to tear. He didn't know that I would be on Elm Street at 1:58 on a Friday, and that the specific route I took would pass a parking spot that happened to be occupied by a 1974 Cadillac DeVille driven by a retired attorney who had known my father and who carried his credentials in his breast pocket as a matter of personal discipline. He had planned for everything he could control. He had not planned for the random, specific texture of the world. I pulled the envelope I'd been keeping notes on toward me and wrote the morning list. 1. Call Patricia Crown. Connie says she is terrifying. Good. 2. All estate documents. Single folder, copies to Margot. 3. Recorded call. Save in 3 places. 4. Dennis's desk file. Margot has photos. 5. Call City Planning Monday. Acquisition timeline. 6. Don't touch joint accounts yet. 7. Call Theo. I looked at the list. I looked at the pincushion. Irene used to say, "The best seams are the ones you can't see." I'd thought she meant hidden, invisible, the kind of construction that left no trace. Now I sat in the kitchen at 3 a.m. and thought maybe she had meant something else. The best seams are the ones that hold when everything pulls against them. The ones you've set with enough care and enough patience that the pressure only makes them stronger. To the pincushion, to the kitchen, to nobody. Okay, I texted Theo. Filing for divorce Monday. If I have questions about the POA legality, may I call you? He replied at 4:02 a.m. I suspected he had been awake too. Yes, your father would be proud of you. Sleep. I didn't sleep, but something settled. Patricia Crown's office was on the 17th floor of the building on Commerce Street, with the glass exterior that caught afternoon light as if it had been specifically designed to look like it was on fire. The view from her conference room window was the entirety of Hartwell from above, the river and the old mill district and the commercial corridor, and beyond it, barely visible, the Calder Road stretch and the farmland that was not yet farmland anymore, but would soon be something else. I noticed this view and filed it. Patricia Crown herself was 53, silver-haired, and possessed the compact, forward-leaning energy of someone who has spent 20 years solving problems that other people allowed to develop into catastrophes, and has a specific impatience for the allowing. She reviewed my documents for 22 minutes without saying anything. She asked, at the end, "How old was the power of attorney when you signed it, measured from the date of death?" 3 weeks, I said. She made a note. She asked, "Did you receive independent legal counsel prior to signing?" "No," I said. "I didn't know to ask for it." She made another note. She listened to the recording, the full 11 minutes. When it reached 4 minutes and 32 seconds, she made a small mark in the margin of her legal pad without looking up. She closed the folder. Direct, not unkind. The revocation held. The sale didn't close. The farmhouse is fully and unambiguously yours. That's your foundation. And the divorce? Connecticut is equitable distribution. An inheritance is generally classified as separate property. Combined with documented evidence that your husband took active steps to misuse a legal instrument executed in good faith to transfer your inheritance at a fraudulent, below-market price for his personal financial benefit, you're in a strong position. She tapped the folder. The text messages establish intent. The timeline establishes premeditation. The recorded call establishes knowledge. He knew the survey value. He chose the $85,000 anyway. He didn't technically steal anything. The sale didn't close. He attempted, over a period of 8 months, to fraudulently misappropriate a marital asset, specifically your separate inheritance, using a legal instrument you signed under false pretenses for his personal enrichment, in coordination with an undisclosed romantic partner and a business associate. She paused. Whether he completed the theft is a question of timing. What he intended and what he did to pursue that intention is thoroughly documented. And Hess? She was quiet for a moment. A professional weighing moment. Hess's preparation of an overbroad power of attorney at the request of one spouse without independent consultation with the principal spouse is an ethics violation. I'd recommend a state bar complaint. Whether it rises to civil malpractice depends on whether you can demonstrate damages, which, given that the sale didn't close, is nuanced. But the complaint is appropriate, and I'll help you file it. I absorbed all of this. How long do you think the divorce will take? Depends on whether he fights it. My recommendation is to make it very clear to him very early what you have and what you're prepared to use. Men who have done what your husband did tend to make one of two choices. They fight or they cut their losses. Given his financial situation, she glanced at the notes, the debts, the failed partnership, no liquidity, he may find fighting expensive. I left the office at 5:40 with a retainer signed and a folder of instructions and the specific, focused calm of someone who has handed the technical part of a problem to a professional and freed up space in her head for everything else. Theo Ashworth was in the lobby. He had not said he'd be there. He stood when he saw me, looking at the folder, approving. Good? Terrifying, in exactly the right way. Good. We went to the coffee shop on River Street with the espresso worth going to. We sat for an hour. He told me things about my father I hadn't known, stories from 30 years back, the specific character of my father as a young man, the way he'd argued in a deposition, and the way he'd handled being wrong. He told me about his wife, the architect, who had died 11 years ago and whose drafting table he still kept in his study. He said, at some point, turning his espresso cup slowly, documents always tell the truth eventually. People believe they can manage what a document says. They can't. A document doesn't protect anyone. It simply contains what happened, and sooner or later, the right person reads it. I thought about Elm Street, about the specific seam failure of a plastic grocery bag. Do you always carry your credentials in your coat? I always carry documents. Dennis met with his own attorney 3 times in March. The attorney was a man named Gerald Park, not the turkey, unrelated, who apparently advised Dennis very early in the process that his position was weaker than he had hoped and that cooperation would cost him less than a prolonged fight. I know this because Connie's industry contacts are extensive, and Hartwell is a small legal community, and some things simply become known. The divorce was filed in March and finalized in June. Dennis kept his car, his debts, which were substantial, including personal loans he'd taken against the anticipated income from the Slade transaction, and a credit card balance that had absorbed, I discovered, approximately 18 months of Radisson Thursdays, and the guest room furniture he'd brought from his previous apartment. I kept the house, which Patricia Crown documented and argued with the specific, precise ferocity of someone who knew exactly which seam to pull. The government acquisition of parcel 14-887-C, Calder Road, closed on April 17th, and the wire transfer arrived on a Tuesday morning. The final acquisition price was $382,000, $40,000 above the January preliminary assessment, because the corridor routing had been finalized, and the parcel's specific position had turned out to be more central to the transit hub than the preliminary survey had mapped. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the confirmation number and thought about Irene paying $4,000 for that land in 1961 with Walter and a handshake. Margot across the table, good return. Something almost like laughing or something adjacent to it. 60 years, 1 turkey. The state bar complaint against Hess had been filed in April. I did not know what would come of it. I knew that it existed and that it was documented, and that documents don't protect anyone. They simply contain what happened, and sooner or later the right person reads them. Marcus Slade's River Street Development Partnership listed a different investor by May. Dennis's spot in the partnership, the spot he'd been managing me and Hess and Brooke Finch and an entire 8-month timeline to create the capital for, was filled by someone else. The River Street project broke ground in August. Dennis was not a part of it. Brooke Finch had, by all accounts available to Connie's network, clarified her availability approximately 2 weeks after the notary appointment, which is to say approximately 2 weeks after the capital didn't materialize. I have no feelings about Brooke Finch that aren't complicated and possibly ungenerous, so I will simply note that she made her calculations and I made mine, and we both found ourselves in situations shaped by those calculations. Dennis took a position as a junior associate at a property management company in Bridgeport in July. I heard this through the grapevine, through Connie, who heard it from a colleague who knew someone at the firm. He was managing tenant communications for a residential complex. He was 40. He had told me, when we were 30, that he was going to have his own development company by 40. I thought about this, sitting at the kitchen table one August morning with coffee and Irene's pincushion, and I noticed that I felt very little. Not satisfaction, not sorrow. Just the mild, clean recognition of a fact. The human-shaped disappointment, Rita would probably have said, if he'd been hers. The human-shaped lesson, maybe, if he was mine. I should tell you about Gerald. When the farmhouse situation became active in February, and it was clear that I could not leave him on an unoccupied property, and equally clear that every boarding facility I called had the same response to, "I need to board a 16-pound bronze turkey," a pause, followed by a gentle explanation that they were not equipped, Gerald relocated to my garage. He had a heat lamp. He had a wood chip bed. He had his feeders, updated to the specifications he'd been on at the farmhouse. He had, very quickly, an opinion about the garage that was identical to his opinion about every space he inhabited, which was that it was his space, and I was a welcome, regular guest. The neighbors had mixed feelings. Rita called him the gargoyle and left him alone with a respect that felt mutual. Connie's children were intensely interested in him, and he permitted their interest with measured dignity, like a senior official receiving a school group. Margot looked at him once, said, and asked me to confirm his ESA documentation was current, which it was. He rode in my car twice during this period. The first time was required, a vet appointment I'd scheduled before the February situation, which I kept because Gerald's wellness was not contingent on my domestic circumstances, and because his vet, Dr. Okafor, had established a particular rapport with him, and I didn't want to disrupt it. The second time, Gerald was simply already in the car when I realized it. I had left the door open for 90 seconds while loading a box of fabrics, and when I returned, Gerald was in the passenger seat with the composed attention of someone who has been waiting for this departure to occur and is not going to comment on its tardiness. We were already on the highway before I'd fully processed what had happened. Gerald rode with his beak pointing slightly forward and his attention on the traffic ahead, with the focused stillness of a senior official being transported to an important meeting. On the day I signed the government acquisition paperwork at the city planning office, a Thursday in March, 3 officials, sunlight through the conference room windows, Gerald was in the corridor in a carrier that Theo Ashworth held without comment because Gerald had needed to come for vet reasons and the appointment had run late and there was no time to take him home first. And because Theo Ashworth, when presented with this situation, had simply picked up the carrier and carried it without requiring an explanation. A junior planning official opened the conference room door at one point to confirm a surveying detail and found herself at eye level with a 16-pound turkey regarding her from inside a carrier with the impassive assessment of an entity that has encountered many bureaucratic processes and found them all, in the end, manageable. She confirmed the detail. She went back inside. The acquisition paperwork was signed. Gerald was relocated to a farm sanctuary in Northampton, Massachusetts in April. The facility was run by a woman named Dr. Patricia Nguyen, who had 15 acres, 3 other turkeys, and a tone of voice that suggested she'd handled more complex personalities than Gerald and was not in any way concerned. She called me 2 weeks after his arrival to report that he'd established territorial sovereignty over approximately a third of the property and had begun conducting what appeared to be structured inspections of the perimeter fence. He seems to feel the existing governance structure needs some revisions. That sounds right. Is he always like this? He's always exactly like this. I drove up to Northampton in May on a Saturday with coffee in my thermos and no particular agenda. The sanctuary was off Route 9, down a dirt road, behind a gate with a hand-painted sign. Dr. Nguyen met me at the gate and walked me out to the south field without ceremony. Gerald was on a fence post at the far end of the field, facing east, with the settled authority of a magistrate who has rendered his verdict on the landscape and found it legally adequate. The 3 other turkeys were in the middle field, at a respectable distance that I suspected Gerald had established. Around him, 10 acres of April, Massachusetts, greening up, with a long, pale sky above. I walked up to the fence. He turned his head. He looked at me with the steady, considering assessment that I had first experienced 7 years ago in Irene's yard, when he was deciding whether to approve me. "You okay?" Gerald blinked once, slowly, with the unhurried finality of someone who has achieved adequate conditions and is choosing not to belabor the point. He looked back toward the east field. Something in the tree line apparently required monitoring. That seemed like the right answer. I opened Wren and Stitch in September in a converted Victorian on Arbor Street that had been a photography studio for 30 years and still had the most beautiful north-facing light I had ever worked in. The space was not large, a front room for display and consultation, 4 fitting rooms, and the workroom in the back where the light was best and where I set up my machines and Irene's sewing table, which I'd brought from the farmhouse along with her sewing basket and the box of mismatched buttons and the pincushion in its permanent place on the work surface. The name was Rita's idea, sort of. She'd been helping me paint the front room in July, both of us in clothes we didn't care about, and she'd looked at the window and said, "It needs something on the glass, something with your name in it." Wren and something. Without looking up from her roller. Wren and Stitch, obviously. Obviously. Helen Myers at Premier Designs sent a card and a brief handwritten note wishing me success. She did not mention the 15% gap, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I wished her sincerely well and meant it. She'd employed me for 8 years and paid me below market and called me indispensable, and all of those things were true simultaneously, and I was done accommodating the gap between what I was worth and what I was being offered. The Stitch and Switch girls came for the opening on a Saturday that was still warm enough to have the front door propped open. Rita arrived with champagne and the navy jacket she'd been relining the night of the first emergency meeting. Finished now, beautifully done, the silk lining set perfectly with the kind of patience that looks effortless when it isn't. She hung it on the display rack herself. Looking at it on the rack, first item in the shop, firmly to her, "That's yours. I'm not selling it." "Damn right you're not. 9 months I worked on that." Margot brought flowers and an index card with the library's cataloging number for textile arts as a field, and she made a small speech about the social function of repair culture as an act of resistance against disposability that was more moving than anyone had expected, including Margot. Connie cried, which surprised everyone, including Connie. She denied it immediately, citing allergies, to which Rita said nothing, which was its own form of kindness. Theo Ashworth arrived at 3 in the copper Cadillac, double-parked in front without apparent concern for this, and came in with a bottle of wine that turned out to be significantly more expensive than anything I would have chosen, and which we opened that evening. He walked slowly around the shop with his clear gray eyes, taking in everything: the fitting rooms, the work table, the display racks, the light from the north windows. He stopped in front of the framed photograph near the fitting rooms. It was a photograph I'd had printed from my phone at the drugstore on River Street in a simple black frame. Gerald T. Wren on the porch roof of the Calder Road farmhouse, facing away from the camera, surveying his domain. The small brass label at the bottom read, "Original Investor." Theo stood in front of it for a long moment. Very quiet, something warm in it. "Your grandmother." I looked at the photo. He picked up everything I dropped, too. Theo turned to look at me. He had the expression of someone for whom a piece of information has settled into place and made a larger thing make sense. "That's rather good, actually." We stood in the shop with the September afternoon outside and the new lock on the door and the fitting rooms lit up and Irene's pincushion on the work table, and I thought, this is what 11 years of marriage with the wrong person and one afternoon on Elm Street with the right document has produced. A shop in a Victorian on Arbor Street with a turkey on the wall and my grandmother's sewing basket in the back room, and a name on the glass door that has always been mine: Wren and Stitch. It was the second Tuesday of December, which meant Stitch and Switch was at my house. The kitchen was different from how it had been in February. Not dramatically. It was the same room, the same window, the same counters, but it had the particular character of a space that belongs entirely to the person who lives in it, which it now did. There was a sewing table in the corner of the living room. There was a framed piece of embroidery on the kitchen wall that Margot had made, which said "Seam Ripper" in cross-stitch, and which was the kind of joke that required specific knowledge to find funny. Rita's jacket hung on the hook by the door because she kept leaving it and I kept not mentioning it. There were 4 of us at the table: Rita, Margot, Connie, me. Malbec on the table, garments in various stages of revision. Margot was turning a skirt into something entirely different, cutting it apart at the seams with the methodical pleasantness of someone who finds decomposition interesting rather than final. Connie was replacing a zipper on a coat while simultaneously managing 3 separate text conversations about property listings. Rita was narrating the renovation of her guest bathroom while taking in the waist on a blouse. These 2 activities apparently not requiring different parts of her brain. I was working on a commission, a wedding dress for a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who had the kind of bone structure that made simple cuts dramatic, and who trusted me completely, which was the most generous thing a client could do. I was at the basting stage, the dress pinned and shaped on the form, working out where the fabric wanted to lie and where I needed to negotiate with it. He told me the slope was fine. I showed him the level app on my phone. He looked at me like I had invented physics. I said, "I know what a P-trap is. I know what a 1/4 inch per foot means. Just fix it." This is why I do my own staging. "You staged your own house?" "My house, my parents' condo, my sister's apartment. If you want something done correctly, you must. If you want something done, show up early and bring your own tools. Complete philosophy. It works in every field." "What's the commission, Lita?" "Wedding dress, Evelyn Marsh. She's got extraordinary shoulders. I'm keeping the neckline simple and letting the structure do the work." "When's the wedding?" "April. Enough time." "I heard the River Street project broke ground." A short pause. "I heard." Good news for commercial tax revenues. Whatever. Rita, without particular weight. Whatever. Whatever. Yes. I looked up from the dress and looked around the kitchen table. Rita with her blouse and her bathroom renovation and her fundamental, reliable presence across the street. Margot with her skirt and her index cards and her quiet capacity to document anything that needed documenting. Connie with her zipper and her phone and her real estate brain that had connected Slade to the River Street deal in under 4 minutes on the worst evening of my year. And the kitchen, which was warm, and the wine, which was good, and the dress on the form in the corner, which was going to be extraordinary. I thought about what Dennis had been trying to sell, not just the land, the specific stability of this. Tuesday evenings, women around a table, wine and fabric and truth. The thing that doesn't appear on a survey report. The thing you can't put on a purchase and sale agreement. The infrastructure that a marriage built and a betrayal couldn't touch because it didn't belong to the marriage. He had studied me for 11 years and known where I was soft and used it with precision. He had not known, had not thought to look at what was hard. Rita, noticing I've gone somewhere, "Where'd you go?" Back, present, the dress in my hands. "Nowhere. Right here." Rita, returning to the blouse. "Good. Stay." Outside, December was doing its slow, gray business. The fitting rooms at Wren and Stitch were booked through January. Evelyn Marsh's dress was going to be extraordinary. Gerald was on his fence post in Northampton, sovereign in his own jurisdiction, conducting his regular assessment of the east tree line. I set the bodice flat on the table. I picked up the pincushion, Irene's, the faded red velvet, the thumb-worn smooth place on the side, and I turned it in my hands the way I'd been turning it since I was 7 years old, and she was teaching me that the point of the work is not the finished seam, but the understanding of how the seam wants to lie. The best seams are the ones you can't see. I had thought she meant invisible, hidden, the kind of construction that left no trace. But sitting at the December table in the kitchen that was mine, with the dress half built and the wine and the women and the second Tuesday, I understood for the first time what she'd actually meant. The best seams are the ones that hold when everything pulls against them. The ones you've set with enough patience and enough care that pressure only makes them stronger, not because nothing pulls against them, everything always does eventually, but because the work was done right, because you didn't rush the foundation, because you knew where you were putting the needle before you put it in. I set the pincushion back in its place. I picked up the dress. I kept sewing.